If you're a bread lover, you'll know that yeast is a key ingredient in many types of bread. Yeast allows the bread to rise, which in return helps give it its fluffy texture. If you are planning on making your own bread, you may wonder, how does yeast work? You may not know this, but the yeast you use to make bread is actually live. It is a single-cell organism that not only allows the bread to rise, but also helps give it flavor and texture. In addition, it helps strengthen the proteins in bread. When looking at bread recipes, you'll notice that many of them will say to add warm water to the yeast. When warm water is added to yeast, it reactivates it, allowing it to do its wonders in the bread-making process. When yeast is added into bread dough, it breaks down large starch molecules into simple sugars. When this happens, carbon dioxide and ethyl alcohol are created, which creates air bubbles in the dough, which leads it to rise. When you buy yeast, it is generally sold in a packet. It is common for 3 packets to be sold together. Each packet of yeast contains 1/4 ounce, which is the equivalent to 7 grams or 2¼ teaspoons. Though it varies by recipe, most bread will call for 1 packet, or slightly less than that, of yeast. You can also buy yeast in jars or bags, which can be great if you do a lot of baking. However, packets of yeast are often ideal, as you don't have to worry about any moisture getting in, which will affect the yeast. When it comes to baking bread, there are generally 4 different types of yeast that can be used. The active dry, instant, rapid rise and fresh yeast are the types of yeast you will find for bread. Certain recipes may call for a specific type of yeast, while some can use any type. Active dry and instant yeast are the most common types of yeast you can use. They are readily available in grocery stores and can be bought in packets. Active dry yeast generally needs to be added to water before adding it to the dry ingredients. Instant yeast generally does not need to be added to water and can be added directly into the dry ingredients. There is a slightly different taste between active dry and instant yeast since they come from a different strand, but they generally can be used interchangeably in bread recipes. The rapid rise and fresh yeast are less commonly used in baking bread. Rapid rise yeast is similar to instant yeast, however, it does come from a different strain that gives a stronger rise. Fresh yeast can be tricky to find, but it can be a good option if you do a lot of baking. Also known as compressed or cake yeast, it can only be kept for about a week in the refrigerator. Unlike the other yeasts, it comes in a solid block form and needs to be crumbled and dissolved in water. Though yeast does expire, it has a long shelf life. Yeast that is sold in packets, such as active dry or instant, can be stored at room temperature in a dry spot for 12 to 18 months. Dry yeast is typically good 2 to 4 months past the best by date. After that, it will likely not be good to use. An open packet of instant or active dry yeast can be stored in an airtight bag or container for 3 to 4 months in the refrigerator or in the freezer for up to 6 months. If you want to extend the life of your unopened packets of yeast, you can store them in the freezer for several years. To test if your yeast is still good, you can add 1 teaspoon of sugar to a 1/4 cup of water and stir it together with 1 packet of yeast in a measuring cup. If the yeast foams up to the ½ cup mark after 10 minutes, it is still good to use. Please comment if you have any questions about how much yeast is in a packet or anything else regarding using yeast.